You are listening to the new man beyond the Macho Jerk and the New Age Wimp. Your host is men's coach Tripp Lanier.
Is it dangerous to believe in God or something bigger than yourself? What do Mars colonization, cults, and the pursuit of heavenly salvation have in common? And why are so many of us feeling spiritually lost? Jamie Wheal is the co-author of Stealing Fire and the executive director of the Flow Genome Project. He's returned to discuss his latest book, Recapture the Rapture. And today, we talk about the world's crisis of meaning, why groups sometimes make us dumber, and trying to fill the God-shaped hole in our hearts. All right, you get pretty bold here in Recapture the Rapture. You say, we're going to learn how to revitalize our bodies, boost our creativity, rekindle our relationships, and answer once and for all the questions of why we are here and what do we do now. Easy stuff. Real, real simple. No problem, right?
No doubt. Well, it seemed like the era of, TED Talky, big thinky books is officially over, and we actually need to get a little bit more descriptive and prescriptive.
Yeah. Okay. I appreciate that. There's no shortage of things that are laying out the problems and then just kind of leaving us on our own to deal with it. So from your perspective, well, let me come back to one of the things that impacted me most as I was reading through the book was this story of you realizing that something was missing in your life. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, we're just, dirt poor students in Boulder. And the cheapest entertainment we had was to get high and go to the Boulder bookstore and get a bottomless cup of coffee, the hippie ski ball, and then go browse the aisles. It was before Google, right? So that's what you did. You just kind of to see what was out there somewhere between the magazines and the old books. You could pretty much get a good groove going and just stumble into neat new information. Mm-hmm. They used to always have public lectures in the upstairs part of the Boulder Library, right? And I remember wandering up there. I was like, great, more free entertainment. Like I'm in. And there was this rabbi up there, and he was rapping and he was describing his story. And it was Rabbi Zalman Schachter, and he at the time I think was teaching at Naropa, which was Chogyam Trungpa's original kind of Buddhist college in Boulder, and he had been a dippy hippie. He was somehow, I think Alberta, Canada was actually one of the, who'd have thunk it, early hotbeds of LSD research in the 50s and 60s, right? And so it kind of leaked out as it did everywhere. It leaked out of the hospitals and the institutions, and he got whacked with the lysergic stick in 1962. And he's like, okay, I'm all in on the communal countercultural experiment. But then as he's standing up and delivering this rap, he's like, but, I went to the Wailing Wall in Jerusalem, and I was kind of inquiring. He had become initiated in the Sufi tradition. He'd become initiated in all these sort of world religions and spirituality. He had basically turned his back on Orthodox Judaism. He goes back to the Wailing Wall, and he's kind of, having a dialogue with God kind of thing. He's like, what should I do? What direction should I take? And he said every time he would kind of think a potential pathway through, like maybe I get to be a Sufi mystic, or maybe we should do the hippie commune thing. This voice would come back and go, but Zalman, you're a Jew. and he kind of right. And he kept trying to dodge it. And then enough times this kept happening. He's like, son of a bitch, I guess I am. And that in conjunction with Ken Kesey, who had been one of my kind of idols, I had one of his quotes in my college yearbook, and I'd read Electric Kool-Aid Acid Test and One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. And I was like, this dude's the man. I was way more a West Coast Kesey prankster guy than I was a East Coast Ram Dass Leary guy, right? I was much more like, let's be psychedelic superheroes. Let's fucking go, let's travel the American West and live large, right? Mm-hmm. And later in Kesey's life, his son, who was a wrestler like him, had been killed in a rollover accident of an RV on the way back from a wrestling match. Mm. And that profound grief had cracked Kesey open, and he had returned to the faith of his origin as an Oregon farm boy, and he had sort of refound Christianity. And between those two, I was like, whoa, what the hell?
How is that possible? You've already gone down this road. How could you possibly return?
Yeah, it's like Dylan getting Jesus in the late 70s. You're like, is this a sellout? Like, what the hell, right? And so I went home and I was sitting on our futon and I was just probably listening to some Grateful Dead or something. And I was like, and I sort of just tears started streaming down my face because I'm like, I'm fucked. Like, I don't have a choice in this. Like, this is the faith I am steeped in. This is the idiom. These are the archetypes, and I can't get away from them no matter how hard I try. Like,
for you, it was Christianity.
Well, yeah, I mean, it was the archetype of the Christ. It was the Nazarene. It was closer to like a Robert Graves, Fraser, Golden Bow. It was this kind of mystic European Green Man, Robin Hood, Nazarene, sacrificial king, Tom Robbins and Jitterbug Perfume, like that whole thing. Right, I could not get away from. And it felt for a moment, because I had studied undergrad and graduate everything other than Western Europe and US. I fucking hated it. It was like, show me Taoism, show me Buddhism, show me indigenous traditions, like anything but this Moloch deathborg, right. And to come back to it felt, and I just kind of realized, I was like, well, Buddhism I thought was fascinating, but Buddha didn't have any of the pathos, the struggle and the suffering, the uncertainty. It just felt like, I make a joke of this in the book, but he felt like kind of like the Roger Federer of enlightenment. Like, you don't even
call him a trust fund prince that got it right. Yeah.
Yeah. Right. And then beamed up to the mothership. He's like, peace out, folks. I need to mark the bow tree,
It's hard to relate to that story.
It's super hard. You're like, go for it, Siddhartha. You're a badass. You're like kind of the Brad Pitt of, his era. And then, and Lao Tzu, the sort of apocryphal sage of Taoism, is just fully formed in all the stories. There's no path to how he got to woke. He's just chubby and happy and chilling. And the only thing to say is, if you're suffering, you're out of alignment with the Tao. If you're in alignment with the Tao, everything's roses. And so that was, again, inspirational for action sports, inspirational for music and celebration and all sorts of gooey, groovy things, but absolutely fucking useless to me as an angry young man, as an angst-riddled, existential, cosmic orphan. Like, what the fuck, know? And then, and obviously Islam, as many people have noted, right, has relatively, didn't go through a reformation, has relatively, on the one hand, in the mainstream and even in some of the fringe sects, a fairly medieval perspective. Muhammad was a decidedly historic figure, right? Militaristic, conquering, kicking ass, taking names. And then you kind of get this, you get Hafez and, you get Rumi and you get folks like that who are the kind of spin-off mystics. But again, nowhere in there could I quite locate my lived experience.
Right.
And so then I kind of had this puzzling realization too, which is that the elements of, we'll just call it the Nazarene. I'll refer to the dude, right? Distinct from Orthodox Christianity, because that's just so problematic and burdened, right? So I kind of had all these weird injections and exposures, but I was always a stranger in a strange land, right? I was on the outside looking into those experiences, never feeling that they were mine to have. And then I realized, I was like, oh, well, the notions of death, rebirth, the notions of struggle, sacrifice, and redemption, right? All of these really profound metaphors that just like went straight down the pipes and are like, oh my God, like that soothes my soul. That speaks to my experience. They were mystic, Christic, right? They had that sense of that sacrificial king kind of thing, but they didn't come from Christianity at all. It was like, everybody knows this one, but I mean, I remember watching that Oliver Stone movie, Natural Born Killers, right? With Woody Harrelson. And I think, who else is in that? Is that Brad Pitt as well? It's definitely that Juliette Lewis. That's what it is.
Juliette Lewis, yeah.
Yeah. So torqued movie, but part of the soundtrack is that Leonard Cohen tune, Anthem. Ring the bells that still can ring, forget your perfect offering. There is a crack in everything. It's where the light gets in. And I remember just getting goosebumps. I didn't even know who was singing it. I'm like, what the hell was that?
Yeah.
And he's a Zen Jew. And you're like, so wait, he's singing about, right, redemption and light through our suffering. Pema Chodron, right? To be alive is to be continually thrown out of the nest. It is to die again and again. You're like, okay. And she's Tibetan nun. And then, most folks are familiar these days with like the Japanese concepts of wasabi or wabi sabi, and wasabi is a different thing.
We know wasabi, yeah.
Wabi sabi and kintsugi, right? The idea of like, when a vase breaks, you glue it together with golden glue, and the unique imperfections make it that much more beautiful. And then I was like listening to NPR, and there was this story of this Chinese family, and they even have a concept called chongzi, which is joy bathing, which is literally the idea that we can make ourselves healed and whole by experiencing joy and happiness and pleasure. So you're like, holy shit, like this is ubiquitous. This is a world tradition. And yet they all kind of speak to this thing of the irreducible intersection, right, of grace and grit, right, to borrow Ken's term, right, of the agony and the ecstasy, right, of like life is magic and tragic, and we're stuck at that intersection, and that is irreducible and unresolvable. And that is fundamentally the mystery of the human experience. And to make peace with that is to unlock, right, the peace that passeth all understanding. So you're like, oh shit, that's a thing.
And that's the part that's relatable, right? I'm not perfect. I'm not Siddhartha. I'm not Lao Tzu. I can't grasp those stories, but I can grasp I'm not perfect. I fall down. And can I get back up? Oh, yes, I can. I can get back up. And that's where we find ourselves. And that's that's a cultural thing. It's not just a personal thing. It's a cultural thing. We've been steeped in that, and we're soaking in it. And then therefore to try and remove ourselves from that for the reasons of, hey, this isn't rational. This is batshit, or I can't get behind this political, powerhouse thing that's going on, and the touchy priests and all that kind of stuff. But we've abandoned that part of ourselves. And there's this God-shaped hole, as you said. And so how do we reclaim that without giving up a part of ourselves? I think that's the part that's sticky when you look at Dylan going back, or some of these other folks that go back and reclaim it. It seems absurd to go back. So what have they done, and what have you done maybe to say, hey, I can transcend and include the best parts, or what are you doing there?
Yeah, well, I mean, for ages, I just sat on this because I couldn't solve it. I'm like, fuck me, man. Christianity has got such irredeemable branding issues. And I was like, mate, how do we, right? I mean, how do we do this? Like, do you call it, I literally played with that. I'm like, put an X, like Zianity, well, I mean, it's a gross simplification, right? Obviously there's profound insights and beauty and contributions over the last 2000 years within the kind of broader container of, quote unquote Christianity. There's also been shit piles of conflict, hypocrisy, bloodshed, all sorts of things.
Oh yeah.
So the question for me was, you can do this infinite regress as to who was Jesus really. And if you kind of look at the landscape of interpretation, you're like, some people say he was just a dude. Some people say he was a man who became enlightened, so kind of analogous to Siddhartha. Some will say he was the divine son of God all along, and he was kind of just play acting. Some people say he was 50-50, and that's what makes it such a gripping story, and he had to figure it out. Christopher Hitchens would say he was a total fucking fiction for superstitious goobs. Other comparative religious scholars would say, no, look, I mean, there's Mithras, there's all these other Near and Middle Eastern solar mystery cults, and his story from the virgin birth to the myth of Christmas with the manger and the wise men in the cave and the gifting, all these things have been told 1,000 times. He's just a mashup of Middle Eastern mystery cults, right? It's just literally, a pastiche. And you kind of figure, okay, well, which one of those is quote unquote really true? By and large, almost impossible for us to sort from now. But the meme of Jesus, right, that has persisted for 2,000 years, has virally replicated and has rippled around the world in ways that few other sort of narratives in this category have. Right. And you can do the historical political. You can be like, oh, Emperor Constantine gave it the rubber stamp of the Roman Empire, European colonialism, guns, germs, and steel. You can say, there's a lot of really tactical, practical reasons why it spread as fast and far as it did. But on the other hand, it is a profoundly resonant story. And I think that just inquiring at the level of the Jesus meme, of all possibilities, kind of like quantum, superposed waveform, like, which was it? What is it? Yeah. I think that story is profoundly relevant without having to collapse into any particular doctrine or dogmas.
And so when you're sitting on the couch there as a student, and the tears are coming down your face. What are you yearning for? Because it's not really about that history. There's something in that moment that's missing, or you're longing. Yeah. What was that you can speak to from that first person point of view?
I mean, to me, it's kind of weird, because as you ask that, I'm like, I don't pray, right? I don't beseech, or like, I don't feel like I have an I-thou relationship, right? Like that Martin Buber beautiful kind of phrase of like me and you, and like, we're in this together, and you're on my shoulder, or you got my back, or, whatever. I've remained, not by any choice, but I'm just a lot more agnostic than that. But on the other hand, that his story, and I mean, even saying his doesn't even quite feel right. Like, that's overly personified and kind of triggers, he's smuggling in a fucking, preachy thing. It's like, nope. It's more, to me, it's that notion of we're all cosmic orphans, right? We, and the Germans have a term for it. They call it Weltschmerz, which is literally like feeling the wound of the world. Right? We're all born the first time. And unless you subscribe to some form of like soul selection and your baby comes on purpose kind of thing, but more or less, right? I mean, we're accidents of fuckery. Two people got together and got it on at least once, and we happened. And we're pushed out into this world completely against our will from this beautiful amniotic sac of, womb warm and comfort. And we're like, what the fuck? This is cold. It's loud. It's bright. It's scary. We hit adolescence. We're like, who am I? We hit early adulthood. You're like, how the hell do you pay rent and make food and do a job that doesn't suck your soul? And what about all the suffering everywhere else in the world? And how is this thing even happening? And is this just fair, equitable, beautiful, good, and true? I don't fucking know. And yet there's this chance, right, through death, rebirth initiations, right, where we actually, for the first time in our lives, get to choose this lifetime. And if you think about most spirituality, most self-help, most pop psych, all of it is about escaping this fucking thing. Whether it's learn and master the secret, whether it's psychedelic therapy, whether it's belonging to a community or a practice, a faith practice, biohacking, you name it, they're all smuggled in utopian exit plans.
I'm going to get out of this thing once and for all.
Yes. Then everything will, someday, everything's going to be different when I paint my masterpiece. Right. And instead, if we have that chance to literally die and reborn, I mean, Goethe said it beautifully. He said, he who does not know the secret, die and become, will remain forever a stranger on this earth. And I think that stranger part, that's the cosmic orphan. That's like, fuck, I didn't choose this. And this is weird and hard and scary. And, nature is red in tooth and claw, and life is nasty, brutish, and short. And I don't see the way through this maze. But the death rebirth experience, and we have this in all of our stories, right? I mean, this is why everybody watches Jimmy Stewart and A Wonderful Life at Christmas. It's also why we watch, Ebenezer Scrooge, right? Those moments, it's Dorothy, right? Coming back home, having done her heroic journey and going, oh my God, there really is no place like home. But you ranch hands, you fuckers who were like inbred, toothless, probably a little rapey kind of creepy dudes, you were the Tin Man, you were the lion, you were the scarecrow. Now I understand your true essence. Now I understand my place in the scheme of things, and I'm all in.
Yeah. That home, that sense of home, that I belong here. But I love how you said, I choose this. And so if we were born into that ideology, we wouldn't necessarily choose it. So maybe we're removed from it, divorced from it. But then we feel that ache of separation. Like the only place that I'm separate from everything else in the universe is this default mode network that says me, 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 not everything else. And that's a painful, achingly painful place to be, separate from everything. So I love this choice to come back home, to find that, but then to not lose ourselves again, to come back and own our authority, own our power, as you're talking about in this book, that we can come back to that place, find our home again, find our place of belonging, our connection to everything, but still be ourselves. It's not either or. That's the threat, is if I go back to this ideology, or if I embrace this again, I'm going to lose who I am in the process. Is that what you're saying?
Well, yeah. I mean, I think the beauty of it, right? I mean, the technical term for the person on the other side of that death rebirth initiation is anthropos, right? And Harold Bloom at Yale has riffed on that. He's talked about that being like really profoundly part of the American tradition. He's like, it's heretical and it's hermetic, meaning it's kind of secretive or sealed, but it's absolutely in opposition to what the Vatican would have ever signed off on or what the Protestant church. I mean, America was founded by freaks and misfits. So like
get on the boat, baby.
Like, I mean, the highly experiential, I mean, the first and second Great Awakenings, everything from, the 60s counterculture to Burning Man has all been of a feather, which is we reject orthodoxy. We reject institutional tops-down control. We privilege direct experiential, right, connection to source and the divine. And so that sense of what does it mean to actually be given the choice to choose the rest of our life with full volition is profound. With the advent of the Judeo-Christian Alpha, in the beginning was the word, and Omega at the end, right? There's a resolution to this whole thing. That instantiated a form of linear times arrow, right? And from that, every single story, more or less, right, secular and sacred, for the last 3,000-4,000 years has had that DNA baked into it, which is we started in a place of perfection. We fell from grace. That's the East of Eden, kicked out of the garden thing. There is an inflection point in the future which changes and transforms everything, and then it comes up roses. And many scholars have, I think accurately pegged it. Communism, right, was basically that identical story stripped of God, but following the exact same framework, right? Yuval Harari did this in Sapiens, right? Like we were fine until the agrarian revolution, right? Communism was like, we were fine until the industrial revolution. Then capitalists took over. Proletariat man is everywhere in chains, right? And then there's going to be the communist revolution, and we're going to have a communist utopia on the other side. And he was also, and at the time, Gray was writing in like 2008, he was talking about neoliberalism in the Middle East. He's like, even this is the same fucking thing. Topple the dictators, get rid of the baddies, Arab Spring, democracy, and McDonald's for everyone. And it was like, whoops, that didn't quite happen, right? And you now see blockchain and crypto and seasteading and psychedelic renaissance, pretty much everything going on today where people are still positing, hey, things are bad. I know they're bad. Here's why they're bad. Here's why we slipped from someplace that was groovy. And here's how we get to the happily ever after, is profoundly truthy for us because we've heard every single iteration of this story for centuries. So it's back to kind of Colbert, taking the piss out of George Bush at the White House press conference. Like, it feels truthy to me, and we feel it. And
this is the rapture ideologies that you talk about.
We are suckers for that story because yes, some form, just tell me the out. And that I think is actually pathological at this point, because no matter how you slice and dice it, they're all 1%er solutions. So whether it's, Wahhabi jihadis, right? Like the idea of Islam and ISIS and those kind of things, whether it's Christian Zionists, arming Israel to the teeth to accelerate us to the final battle of Armageddon. That's problematic. But so are space colonies. So is uploading our consciousness to computers. Some techno-utopian raptures are following the same pattern.
Not everybody gets on the bus.
Not everybody gets a ticket to ride. And the moment you actually think that through, beyond the sugar high of the utopian promise, right? You're like, wait a second. Okay, let's think about operationalizing this, that there's 8 billion of us. And there's in none of these stories is there room for more than, 500 million, figuring this out, like max, right? So you're like, okay, so these are all pathological to the extreme. And that's kind of the premise of the book, which is how do we recapture the rapture? How do we recapture the story of how this all goes down? Right? How do we reclaim our passionate intensity, our lowercase rapture, right? Our bliss, our belonging, our connection, our courage, right? How do we reclaim that so that we can actually contribute our voices to architecting a future that works for all of us?
Okay, let's slow down for a second because I want to tie this stuff together, which is we're steeped in these rapture ideologies. We've been eating them and drinking them and watching them our entire lives, right? That there's you even show the arc, the different arcs in the book that we just love this story. And we've watched it over and over again. And now we've got an opportunity to live it. They're scary, right? The end is coming. and there's a way out. And whether it is success that most people are chasing, or it's going to be living on Mars, or it's going to be living in your own silo, or it's going to be living in the promised land, whatever that is, we can buy into these stories that this is my way. This is where I'm going to finally be okay, whatever that utopian vision can be. Okay. And then we might be giving up our form of religion or the community that we grew up in because it bought into one and it didn't make sense to us, or it had a lot of baggage, but we might be trading it for another one.
Yes.
Okay. And then you're saying these are pathological. We want to watch out for this. So the book is essentially saying, hey, we want to be able to identify these pathological rapture ideologies and then come back to our own sense of self to still be able to not. And I love this part because this is where the tendency for me is to get really individualized, because I've just watched community after community just recreate more shit and turn into cults, turn into things like, man, this started out, it was like Fight Club. This is so cool. And then, oh no, you're blowing up buildings. This is not good. So it's like, it's just watching the path or the pattern recreate itself as we get into this mindset. We stop thinking for ourselves. This book is a blueprint. Hey, here's how to come back together, but still think for yourself, still think for yourself, and also reconnect with those places where we feel like we've disconnected and harness those for ourselves, but then also be able to move forward instead of making it the either or.
Yeah. I mean, 100%. And to your point, right, about you've been a part of communities, they seem vibrant and exciting and enthusiastic, and then they somehow end up in the ditch on the same corner, no skid marks. You're like, what the hell? So I mean, my assumption there is actually that it's a feature, not a bug of tribal primates. So rather than going, oh, that indicates a wrongness or that indicates some collapse, you're like, no, that is actually, that's physics. So we have to actually learn to work with the physics better.
This is what happens when we join a community that's based around these ideologies. We can just expect this to happen.
Basically, the way I set up in the book is we're in a meaning crisis, right? We've lost a sense of shared, coherent purpose and direction, and even understanding of like base reality, right? We're all just splintered and factionalized. And that happened because traditional religion, meaning 1.0, has collapsed. There's been the rise of the nuns, the spiritual but not religious. I don't identify with a specific denomination, which is now the largest and fastest growing segment in all of America for the first time in history.
Nuns being N-O-N-E-S, not N-U-N-S.
Yeah. So that was meaning 1.0. And then in the last, you could definitely say post-Berlin Wall, post-9/11, post-08 crash, now into COVID, populism, all these things. We've also seen this crash of meaning 2.0, which had been actually kind of the religion of modern liberalism. So the Enlightenment experiments, civil rights, democracy, markets, all of those kind of things. And basically meaning 1.0, like organized religion offered salvation, but at the cost of exclusion. If you believed you were saved, and if you didn't, you burned in hell or were just outcast. Meaning 2.0, right? The Enlightenment experiment of kind of modern civil society and democracies promised inclusion for everybody, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, regardless of race, color, or creed, right? But at the cost of salvation, right? God is dead. Mm-hmm. And we've seen both of those collapse lately. So even the modern thing, right, which, Sam Harris and Christopher Hitchens and those guys had said, the new atheists, they had said, oh, the time for superstitious religion is done. Everybody's going to be moving into modernity. And that hasn't quite happened. So we've had this sucking vacuum.
We're still wanting to come home. We're still wanting to, all the things that we talked about. Yeah.
So we end up with the folks who are left in the middle with no place to go are getting sucked to the extremes. So you get a doubling down on religion in the form of fundamentalism. And you also end up in Fight Club, right? We're the middle children of history, man. And our great revolution is a spiritual revolution, right? You get sucked into nihilism. And that's the diseases of despair, addiction, suicide, right? I mean, suicide now outpaces all world wars and all natural disasters combined as far as the number of lives it takes each year. And so you're like, holy shit, that's crazy and tragic. So that's the meaning crisis, meaning 1.0, organized religion, meaning 2.0, modernism. What do we do to create meaning 3.0? And so you can make the case that we need to create ethical cultures that instead of requiring an individual to submit to anything, how do we actually use it to boost sovereignty? So I am more in my seat. I'm more in my power. I'm more in my choices. And at the same time, allow for the profound level up of collective coherence, community, and creativity. And we haven't really done that very well up till now. Because when we get boundary dissolving, inhibition lowering group flow or communitas, there's almost always somebody bent that tries to grab the power of that and weaponize it.
Is there something that happens to us too when we get into a group where I always feel like the IQ goes down about 40 points once I'm in a group. And there's this sense of, this is what we're doing and this is where we're going. And I just stop thinking for myself. Is that, what's been studied around that aspect? I understand that there's somebody up there. It's like, man, this can be mine. But then there's something else that's just like, great, I don't have to think anymore. I can just go with the flow. There's that aspect of like, here you go. You decide what we have for lunch kind of thing. I don't want to be burdened by that.
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple of totally different stories that I think, hopefully if you can follow them, that they'll unlock some good insights. Which is the first one that comes to mind, and I just lived this last week doing a ski mountaineering trip. But our buddy Ian McCammon, who was a PhD data scientist at the University of Utah and a Knowles instructor, so he was a badass outdoor guide, avalanche forecaster, all these kind of things. And he studied the huge data set of avalanche accidents in North America. And what he found was, he goes, this is really weird. Basically, the more avalanche training you have, the more likely you are to get killed by an avalanche. And he's like, that's weird. And so what he realized is he goes, because we never actually deal with reality. We're always taking shortcuts, which he calls, which people know as heuristics. They're basically rules of thumb that let me to say, if this thing looks like that thing, I'll do the other thing because that worked last time. Right? That's basically how we do it. Right? We're lazy prediction machines. Right. And his insights were, there was, number one, there was expertise. So basically there's a classic example of like 9 top ranked avalanche forecasters and ski patrollers all getting killed at the bottom of a slope because everybody there assumed everybody else there was also super smart and expert. And then you'd be the weenie if you asked the question, right? And so everybody just kind of overrode their own concerns or their own thought process to just defer to this collective group that actually wasn't a collective group. Everybody just assumed everybody else had it wired. And then there's also scarcity, like, oh, there's powder turns. And if I don't get them, someone else will. There's prior evidence. Look, somebody else made turns down that, so it must be safe. There's all these things. And his data analysis completely turned upside down how people train for avalanche and snow safety right now. And this happened to me last week. We were in Crested Butte. And some friends in town were like, hey, you want to go ski that backcountry classic line? And I'm like, yes, I'm all in. And I thought I was going with one of the legends of Crested Butte, who's won all these ski mountaineering races, total pro. Turns out he wasn't home. The next morning I go with a friend and her husband. Turns out they hadn't read the avalanche reports. They had only just taken their level 1 cert. They were locals that knew all the familiarity. They knew all the things. Yeah, we do this every spring, blah, blah, blah. But they hadn't read the report, which said things were kind of shady today. And I was like, oh, fuck, I am finding myself against all better knowledge, sucked into a groupthink situation that could kill me.
I don't want to be the one to be the weenie.
Yes. But I kind of had to, only because of Ian's research, I was like, I'm going to make sure I take responsibility for myself. I'm going to look at the weather report the night before. I'm going to ask these questions. I'm going to say, I think we should ski over here. Like, if I hadn't had that data and those conclusions, like right in the top of mine and the rest of my family going, are you sure, Dad? Like, more people have died this year than in the last century in Colorado. Don't do that. And I'm like, no, I'm gonna. But then I had to kick it in. I had to really, I was like, holy shit, what a crazy slippery slope it is to succumb to groupthink and to take risks that you would never in a month of Sundays rationally or reasonably take just to go along, to get along, and or to get yours. Because if there's something fun to do, right, that's another, that we've sort of become lizard brain fuck monkeys. We're just like, just push the button. I like to feel good.
Yeah. So for Meaning 3.0, we're going to have to animate this. We're going to have to practice this, among other things that you talk about in the book. But this is one of those things, in order for it to happen, we've got to be able to own that authority.
For anyone who these days is kind of torn, like just feels like guardrail to guardrail between, wait, I thought I was kind of like pursuing #best life, that kind of notion of coming alive, like how do I expand my possibilities and opportunities for myself, for all of us, versus the staying alive arc of like, oh shit, quarantine, ice caps, ecological crisis, et cetera. And that's feeling super duper schizophrenic right now. And sometimes overwhelming of like, which storyline am I on? Just that the notion of that courage is actually hardwired into us at our deepest level of being. And our buddy, Andrew Huberman at Stanford, he's a neuroscientist there, and he just published a study in Nature, which literally showed that when they stimulate a mouse's brain in a very specific region, it prompts courageous behavior against mortal threat, like literally like birds of prey, and completely overrides their normal desire to run and hide. And that when given a choice, they choose it over food or sex, and so do humans.
Yeah, you wrote, we'd rather be brave than get laid. I loved that line.
Exactly. So you're like, oh, and it's, poetry you couldn't write, you couldn't make up. That the Latin term for that zone, the region of our brain, is the nucleus reunions, which is literally the seed of our reunion. The seed of how we come together is through our courage. So that's it. It's leave space for grace. Leave space for grace. Beautiful. Thank you so much. The book is Recapture the Rapture. Jamie Wheal, thank you so much for doing this work, man. Dude, great to jam with you, Tripp.
If these interviews are helping you, please leave a positive review on whatever podcast app you use so that others can discover the show more easily.